I'm recording, right? All right, so welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Roger Berkowitz. This is the Hannah Arendt Center Lunchtime Talk Series. And I'm really thrilled to have here Jonathan Graubart from it's UC San Diego? San Diego State, right, from San Diego. San Diego State. We both did our law degrees at Berkeley, which I learned, which is nice, and then he went and did his PhD at Madison in Wisconsin. He specializes in international relations, international law, Zionism, and Jewish descent, Israel, Palestine, the UN, normative theory, and resistance politics. It's a lot of stuff.
Okay, yeah.
But this is his recent book, and it's the reason he's here: Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism. Lessons from Hannah Arendt and Other Pariahs. I'm not going to go on and on at length because I want to have Jonathan have time to talk and you all to have questions. It's a book that's had incredible reviews. Richard Falk describes it as an exciting, profound, and humane critical rethinking of Zionism as the ideological foundation of the Israeli state. I'm going to let Jonathan do his own talking for him, though. It's a pleasure to have you here, and he'll speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have about 45 minutes for Q&A until 1:15.
Great. Well, thank you very much. All right, so I have a preparation for it, so to try to keep myself within the time, I'll read through it. So the focus of the book is in part a recovery of a dissenting Zionist tradition from the pre-1948 era, so the pre-state era, a tradition that opposed a hegemonic Jewish state and insisted on a just coexistence with Palestine's Arabs. And the other part of the book is a quest to stimulate thinking on a contemporary reformation of Jewish self-determination. So to do so, my book consists of a productive conversation between the two people I consider the most insightful of the pre-1948 Zionist dissenters, Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt. And then I engage them in a series of conversations with the early Noam Chomsky and the early Uri Avnery, then with contemporary liberal Zionist Jews, contemporary anti-Zionist Jews, then the premier critical Mizrahi critical Jews, thinker Ella Shochat, and then with Edward Said. So the project is a significant departure from my previous work, which is kind of international relations, international law. I decided to embark upon it because I had become a full professor, and so I had more room to take chances. But substantively, I was just so dejected about the trajectory of Israel and the prospects for a peaceful resolution. So I felt I needed to go beyond my prior focus on international organizations, international law, and the UN, and explore the foundational problems of Zionism and alternatives not pursued. So I turned to my old hero, Hannah Arendt, as my point of departure. I've admired her ever since maybe the late 1980s. I was in my early 20s. I discovered an edition of Eichmann in Jerusalem among my father's books. And sometime after, I learned that she also had very interesting, insightful views on Zionism, so I thought someday I'll get to that. And so I started with her, and so I immersed myself in her Jewish and Zionist writings, mostly from the 1940s, and then rereading several times Origins of Totalitarianism, so I was very serious about my commitment. I also consulted multiple biographies and a collection of writings on her, interviews with her, secondary studies, and so thrilled today to be presenting my work at the Hannah Arendt Center. So just a quick element of the setting of when she's writing this. She's writing this in the 1940s. Up to the late 1930s, all but the hard line, what they were called the revisionist Zionists at the time, all except for them, up to at least the late 1930s, had refrained from advocating for an explicit Jewish nation state in Palestine, recognizing that they didn't have the numbers to call for a Jewish nation state yet, and that this wouldn't go over well with the British mandate. So the official position of people like David Ben-Gurion was, while they desired privately a Jewish state and treated the Yishuv community as a state in the making, the official position was mutual autonomy for the Jews and the Arabs in Palestine, where neither would dominate the other. But with the Arab revolt in 1936, the British Peel Commission report in 1937 that called for a partition into a Jewish and an Arab state, and the unfolding of the Holocaust, most of the Zionist movements and even previously non-Zionist Jewish organizations shifted to a demand for a Jewish nation state over all, or at least a large portion, of the Palestine mandate then. The main holdouts going into the late 30s and the 1940s among the Zionists were left labor Zionists coalescing around Hashomer Hatzair and the group I'm most interested in, that one called Yishuv. They carried out a mantle that I've decided to call humanist Zionists, so a humanist Zionist movement. Its two most prominent figures were the former American Jewish rabbi Judah Magnus, the founder of Hebrew University, and the polymath intellectual Martin Buber. Since the 1920s, this movement welcomed the fostering, they were Zionists in terms of they welcomed the fostering of revived Jewish community in the ancient Holy Land, with the hope that this would bring about a just new society and just a Jewish spiritual renewal. But they opposed the separatist and statist orientation of mainstream Zionist movements for what they saw as undermining the spirit of Jewish renewal and disregarding the concerns of the indigenous Arab population. They favored a binational federation which featured autonomous development for each community, collective equality, and shared spaces of governance and community interaction. So, cutting to Hannah Arendt, she stands out in the following themes, I argue. One is she just gives a sophisticated historical context for the European Jewish experience dating back several centuries. Another is she rejected the homogeneous nation-state model in general. So for Zionism, this meant delinking Jewish self-determination from the state project and finding new political models that would enable coexistence for multiple national groups. Right? She desperately wanted this in Europe, but also in Palestine. Also, she stands out for diagnosing the foundational pathologies of mainstream Zionism. And there were two she focused on: a belief in an eternal anti-Semitism unaffected by politics or historical developments, almost kind of demonic, and then a tribal nationalism that rejected all collaboration other than alliances of temporary convenience with other groups. And then affirmatively, she attached the long-term health of Israel and the Jewish people more broadly to a more just and developed global order. So she opposed the insularity that she saw in mainstream Zionism, and the new order would be one that breaks free from imperialism and the nation-state system. All right, so a little bit about her assessment of anti-Semitism and the nation-state. To her, it was very important to understand anti-Semitism not as some demonic evil, but a political phenomenon shaped by historical events, not a timeless phenomenon. Her focus was on the type of anti-Semitism, so contemporary anti-Semitism, that emerged with the spread of nation-states and became transnationalized with the growth of imperialism. It was important, she argued, not to look upon the Jewish community as simply passive victims of this demonic anti-Semitism, but as agents, meaning the ways Jews would interact with the outside community made a difference. Since the states of Israel, she warned, would follow an extreme type of realpolitik, strong military aggressive stance, distrust of international law or international institutions, and to make yourself useful to a strong imperialist power, right? So first make yourself useful to Great Britain during the British Mandate years, and then the United States would be the big prize. I'll read one of her quotes. The erection of a Jewish state within an imperial sphere of interest may look like a very nice solution to some Zionists. In the long run, there is hardly any course imaginable that would be more dangerous.
What year did she say?
What year? So that was, I think that was the one that came out in, Zionism Reconsidered. So it's 44?
Yeah.
Right, no. And here's her stark warning. I think this one, when I first discovered it, was really haunting, of how Zionism would develop if it didn't overcome these pathologies of eternal anti-Semitism and tribal nationalism. The, quote, victorious, unquote, Jews would live surrounded by an entirely hostile Arab population, secluded inside ever-threatened borders, absorbed with physical self-defense to a degree that would submerge all of their interests and activities. The growth of a Jewish culture would cease to be the concern of the whole people. Social experiments would have to be discarded as impractical luxuries. Political thought would center around military strategy. So she was really worried about how Zionism would develop if it stuck with these pathologies and this fixation on courting power. Her alternative vision, here's a good capsule formulation. The real goal of the Jews in Palestine is the building up of a Jewish homeland, and she distinguished that from a Jewish state. This goal must never be sacrificed to the pseudo-sovereignty of a Jewish state. The independence of Palestine can be achieved only on a solid basis of Jewish-Arab cooperation. Local self-government and mixed Jewish-Arab municipal and rural councils on a small scale and as numerous as possible are the only realistic political measures that can eventually lead to the political emancipation of Palestine. So she did have a vision she took very seriously. And this was linked to her appeal that the Jewish community should be committed to a transformed global order, and so it was urgent to come up with a positive version of coexistence from Palestinians. So one of her quotations is, now, if the non-Zionists had wanted to act as genuine realists in Jewish politics, they should have insisted that the only permanent reality in the whole constellation was the presence of Arabs in Palestine. But it was downright tragic at the most crucial of all moments. The loyal opposition simply disappeared. And then the idea of Arab-Jewish cooperation is not an idealistic daydream, but a sober statement of the fact that without it, the whole Jewish venture in Palestine is doomed. Indeed, the working out of such a modus vivendi might in the end serve as a model of how to counteract the dangerous tendencies of formerly oppressed peoples to shut themselves off from the rest of the world and develop nationalist superiority complexes of their own.
Was that 1944 too? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I should have brought my other book. I didn't. Yeah, it's either from.
It's probably Zionism reconsidered.
Yeah, right. So a lot of these, either there's one that comes out in 48, which has some of the more optimistic ones, and then there's this really bitter one that comes out in 46, I think. Yeah. That's one thing I'll remember for the next presentation. is where it's right down the year. Okay. So Arendt and her fellow binationalists, she by this point joined the broader movement that I referred to. They of course lost out, and with her close ally and friend Judah Magnus dying in 1948, Arendt then stepped away from being a prominent activist in Zionism. She had the indirect interjection with Eichmann in Jerusalem, which still got herself into a lot of trouble, even though she was no longer actively coming in Zionism. Nevertheless, as numerous contemporary critical Jews have come to appreciate, including me, her legacy remains an invaluable guide for the present. And just to give an idea, starting on the cost of forging a Jewish nation state, framed around a siege mentality of unredeemable antisemitism from the others, and the necessity of an ever vigilant and suspicious state. To identify a few salient negative traits that have characterized Israel from the outset, an elevation of militarism and the strength, security of the state of Israel over the ideas of cultural Zionism, a fundamental contradiction between being a liberal democratic state and a Jewish state. This has paved the way for what has now become systematic Jewish supremacy across Greater Israel, right? It's recently concluded by the Israeli human rights group at Salem and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. An international orientation attached to an imperialist order where Israel courts the dominant power and treats international norms and international law as inherently suspect. A mindset that regards its opponents, whether it's the Palestinians, Nasser's Egypt in the old days, contemporary Iran, as existential crisis to the Jewish people on the magnitude of the Holocaust. As such, Ian Lustig has called this Holocaustia. Israel is poorly equipped to taking the necessary steps to reach a sustainable peace when you elevate it to that level. And then, something I feel as an American Jew, so a Jew outside of Israel, is subordinating Jewish life outside of Israel to the security of the state of Israel. So Israel has been a net source of conformity to Jewish life in the diaspora rather than the hope of cultural Zionism, which would be a revitalization. I'll grant that there are some exciting things about it. So it's not all a downer, but I would say the net effect has been a source of conformity. Beyond this, beyond just sort of how she was right and things, I would say I approached this book not just to say she was right, but how to interject fresh thinking into facing the crisis really that's just been growing and growing in the 21st century, and now is really painful. She does, along with others, but I think she's one of the best in inspiring us to rethink what we want from Zionism. For a long time, Zionism in practice has been equated with support for the state of Israel. For Arendt and the other humanist Zionists like Martin Buber, the goal is contributing to the health of the Jewish people in a way that furthers social justice and positively relates to the outside world. Another quote, Zionists therefore try to explain the building of the Jewish national home as the only possible answer to a supposedly eternal anti-Semitism, the establishment of collective settlements, the kibbutzim, as the only solution to the difficulties of Jewish agricultural labor, the foundation of health centers and the Hebrew University in terms of national interest. The point was, however, she said, the responses were a much more permanent human and political value than the challenges. And so a number actually of these critical Jewish Zionists, including the younger Noam Chomsky, had these things they were very excited about what was there in Zionism. It's just they were very worried about the other things that were outweighing it. Second, Arendt is very useful for the necessary task of self-scrutiny, which has become harder than ever post-October 7th. Arendt identifies two of the most fundamental dynamics that Zionists need to shake: the notion of an eternal and potentially genocidal anti-Semitism, and the corresponding attachment to what Jabotinsky called an iron wall, with its kind of siege mentality. You got to really do it to them before they do it to you. She put this well. This was in response to an interview question. This is in the 1960s because it's shortly after writing Eichmann in Jerusalem, so it's probably around 1965 or something. The notion that we can use our enemies for our own salvation has always been to me the original sin of Zionism. And you will understand why I believe that certain elements of the Zionist ideology are very dangerous and should be discarded for the sake of Israel. Third, she inspires, those who really care for the welfare of Israel, and say the Jewish community more broadly, a productive embrace of international law and the international community, not just assuming they're out to get Israel. This was one of her primary arguments at the end of Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the logic extends well beyond counting crimes against humanity, which was her focus on Eichmann in Jerusalem. Fourth, she and the other pre-state humanist Zionists alert us to the urgency of accepting the permanent and deep attachment of Palestinians to all of historical Palestine and the interdependence of Jews and Arabs. So separating the bulk of Palestinians in either a separate state or what's now the situation in isolated, besieged strips of territory is neither morally acceptable nor compatible to a long-term just reconciliation. And while she doesn't offer a specific blueprint for how to overcome the grim nature of really existing Zionism, she does provide a useful set of goals. One is a common set of values: self-determination for both peoples, so for the Jews and the Arabs of Palestine, non-domination, so neither one being able to dominate the other, mutual recognition of the deep attachment of both peoples to all of historical Palestine, the interdependence of both peoples, and the shared goal of richer, more egalitarian lives for all across Israel-Palestine now. Second is the plea for new local, national, regional, and international institutional structures. It's going to be exactly what they proposed in the mid-late 40s, but looking for institutions that build trust, facilitate shared governance, ease the borders, prevent one group from dominating the other, and connecting it to this is going to have to require broader regional and global changes that challenges. I mean, these are big asks, but these are the big things. The imperialist hierarchical structure, the system of nation states that doesn't really have a good way of dealing with multiple national identities within the same states, and facilitating deeper interconnections from below. See, long ago hoped, back in the 1940s, that Jews could be part of the solidarity of the oppressed. So, okay, I'll close with that.
Thank you very much. So, thank you so much, Jonathan. I mean, the Arendtian, as you said, Arendt was deeply involved in Zionist politics for many years and then left it really after Magnus died in 1948.
Yeah. And Kibbutz was kind of the final straw.
And her essay, Zionism Reconsidered, was received so poorly by many people, including many of her friends.
Commentary refused to publish it.
That, it was, it really kicked her out. And then Eichmann, of course, the Eichmann book really kicked her out of the entire Jewish world. Many people today have turned back to Arendt for a whole lot of reasons, some of which you've said, right? Mm-hmm. One is an attempt to understand the mistakes of Jabotinsky Zionism or conservative Zionism that she understood. And then also many today, especially in political theory, have looked to this idea of federations or local institutions, which you were talking about, right? Mm-hmm. And Arendt was a huge critic of the nation state in general. This came out of long before her work on Zionism and her work on Palestine in Europe. And there was this really idea that we could create a homelands for both the Arabs and the Jews, and they could create institutions, local institutions that would work, and there would be maybe a federal state, but you'd have these things. It's a beautiful idea, right? But the critique has been, from the beginning, she brought this up every time there was a world crisis, and the critique was, it doesn't work. I guess what the question is today is, to what extent is that a meaningful practical project? I mean, is there an effort? I mean, her analysis of the situation in the 1940s, I think, is spot on. But how? You're obviously calling this up because you think it can be useful today, and I'm just wondering.
I admit it. Yeah.
I'm just, I look at that and I ask myself this all the time when I'm teaching, because I just taught a course on her Jewish writings. To what extent does this still matter? I guess I'd just like to hear you address, especially with what's going on in the last 2 weeks, but also the last 50, 70 years. Is this still something that you think is a meaningful project, or is it more of a historical time capsule?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I was actually contemplating writing something about this well before, but I did feel very self-conscious in two ways. One, who am I to be proposing these kind of big visions? Second was, that was an exciting idea, the binational movement pre-1948, and it is good to see kind of what happened, and there were a number of influential people supporting that, but what does it matter now? And so I decided that you don't have an alternative. Let's say the old two states. Part of me is still, in my final chapter, I do say that there's elements that still retain. So I haven't become one of those that reject any idea of two states, but I think one has to sort of step back before you can even talk about two states or one state. Is something went very wrong. If the two-state idea, it ended up becoming so butchered, with the Oslo Accords and what that did, and liberal Zionists, and they're in my book. They wrote some appealing things about how that could work. A separate Palestinian state is just, they're kind of grappling. They don't seem to have anything practical either. And so if it comes down to, one needs kind of a fundamental reconsideration without giving up the idea, at least of Jewish self-determination. I think there's two things that I think are still really valuable. One is, if one's going to get some kind of fundamental transformation, it'll probably have more supporters in the American Jewish community, and it will take longer for it to happen in Israel, I mean, given the views of American Jews versus Israeli Jews. But having something that's not just anti-Zionist as your criticism, or just kind of going through the motions. Yes, we support two states, knowing that you don't have any program to make your two-state model work. I think stepping back and thinking, how can we transform this? I guess, I mean, just to quickly say, the second part is the struggle, whether it's in Israel, Palestine, or elsewhere, of coming up with a way of multiple national identities coexisting instead of one struggling for the spoil. It's not unique in the sense that Israel, Palestine, is that it hasn't been solved, but Arendt is still correct that if we don't do this, we're going to keep getting lots of killing and instability.
Just to note that Arendt thought there was only one place in the world where this had, at least for a time, worked, which she thought was the United States. She thought the federal structure in the United States was the only place that allowed for different people of strong national identities and cultural identities, south, north, whatever, west, to work. Now,
in one essay, she said the Soviet Union too.
Yeah.
She might pull that from that, right?
so anyway, I want to open it up, let other people ask questions.
Thanks so much for your talk. I look forward to reading your book.
Oh, great.
I also read your essay on October 11 on common dreams.
Oh, great. Okay.
So I want to ask you something about the talk, and I don't know whether it's from the book. When you talked about the three core principles that comes out from Arendt's critique of Zionism, and one part of it, this whole idea of the real goal of Jewish homeland being coexistence, unity, and new institutions that are anti-imperialist. I like that idea. It sounds great to me. I cannot bring that together with the core fact that the Palestinian people are not actually at all equal partners in that core understanding.
Do you mean back then?
Yeah,
Okay.
so like the whole idea of Palestine becoming a homeland for the Jewish people, where these ideal, principles of coexistence, unity, equality are going to be, organized and practiced together. It would have been great if Palestinian people were actually a part of it. But from the beginning, my historical understanding is that they never had any say on this. They were never asked to give their comments. So I'm having difficulty understanding the picture of Arendt you draw for us as an anti-imperialist picture in that sense. It seems to me very much part of a quite liberal reformulation of imperialism. Does that make sense? Or maybe I'm missing something. Maybe
No, it makes sense. It's like, I guess, two separate. No, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, maybe I haven't read your book. Maybe the argument there is, more grounded in other parts of the writing where maybe Arendt kind of deals with this idea in a more convincing way. But I'm having difficulty convincing myself that I can take this as anti-imperialism of any sorts.
I mean, part of it is, so the various Arendt scholars in here is kind of how does she figure as a critic of imperialism? In a way, she is one of the intense critics of imperialism, so there are some post-colonial scholars, right, that draw from her, like Mamdani draws from her, so the sense of this creation, the solution, just like she blasted the solution after World War I of these new independent states, having a dominant national group. Those ideas were then used to criticize the post-World War II era, that one national group, within the newly decolonized world would dominate. So still, the nation-state model, as she most focused it on Israel, Palestine. So the way I read it is intellectually, she's pretty good on this. She's good both in a broader post-colonial sense and also specifically here attacking the way Zionism just latched itself on to European imperialism. She wasn't like, say, Buber or Magnus or the people actually living in Palestine. She wasn't there in the trenches. But to the credit of like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus, right? They were actively making dialogue, and so Buber, right? He lived in the Palestinian Arab part of Jerusalem. At one point, his landlord was Edward Said's parents or something. He actually got evicted by Edward Said. This is before 48. So, but he was serious. He was serious about it. It's true that you can still fault this movement of the humanist Zionism. The coalition was called Yishuv. Is that their heart was still kind of in the European Jewish experience, and so they didn't really fully, and sometimes they couldn't distinguish Arabs in general versus Arabs of Palestine. So they were trying. I mean, I think their abstract idea, that is certainly Buber's point. So he does it much more explicitly than Arendt, is that this has to be a collaborative thing, and he's blasting. And Arendt is too, just not as intensely as Buber and the others. That's, you're just living alongside the Palestinian Arabs. I think Arendt even says, yeah, you're treating them as some kind of exotic species. You know, look, we're interacting, but you're not really interacting with them. So even Arendt's doing that. But their plea is, this is only going to work. So Buber is even critical of the kibbutzim, saying he was very excited about this kind of participatory socialist system, but he said, until you bring the Palestine Arabs in, this is a major flaw. So I think they identified those elements. They didn't get enough. Judith Butler and others have argued that the very idea of setting up this Yishuv, because like it or not, your vision is not prevailing. It's the vision, and so you're actually still adding to the problem, even if part of your program is kind of appealing. I would say in some sense, that's already done with. And now I'm kind of what to do now. I do think, one thing I did also in my book, I have one chapter that brings in Edward Said and Ella Shochat about how could you expand this? So for Ella Shochat, it's all about the heterogeneous Arab Jewish identity. For Said, it's like the Palestinian identity. So I think there are real flaws in Arendt or even Buber and Magnus, but I don't think those are fatal flaws. I think one can draw from them and then think about how to make this truly interactive. So I agree with you in part that they didn't fully shake themselves from both, say, a Eurocentric mentality and from the imperialism, but their hearts, I think, were in the right place of challenging this imperialist logic and the arrogance of the Jewish faith.
Follow up on that with one.
Yeah.
Just Arendt was not in Palestine at this time. She was not doing it. Buber was, right? And
Yes.
and
Magnus certainly, yeah.
Were there, and I just don't know this because it's not my field, but and I think this is related to Pinot's question, but maybe not. Were there actual institutions that developed that were Jewish Arab that were part of an attempt to create local governments or local organizations at the time that could have been a model? I mean, I think that's related to Pinot's question. It could have been a model for a non-imperialist collective, or was it always just Jewish thinkers saying, let's do this, but it never actually happened? Were there actually institutions that emerged?
I'd say less. I mean, there were a few examples of like labor movements, particularly in Haifa, that really were Jewish-Arab cooperation. What people like Magnus and Buber tried to do was these discussion groups, and they did reach out to find some allies. Look, one problem with Palestine's Arabs is they're understandably very suspicious, and they have a sense that the humanist Zionists don't really have much influence. And so there's all sorts of reasons why you're not going to get more serious, significant institutions. So no, but there is rather interaction.
Okay,
Right.
so I know if I want to learn more about this from the Jewish humanist side, right? I go to Buber and I go to Magnus. Who do I go to if I want to learn more about this from the Arab side? Or is there someone making a similar argument on the Arab side or not?
Oh, you mean pre-1948?
Yeah.
Right, yeah. It's much smaller. Yeah.
So it didn't really have a resonance, or
It had
That's
a
what I'm
much
asking, I don't know.
smaller resonance, I think, because of just basically the position Palestine's Arabs were in, where, look, one side, through the British Mandate, gets to create all these institutions and gets the immigration. And so the other is suspicious. It doesn't stop dialogue. Buber himself is quite well liked. I remember, so he has to leave his home, right, in 48 during the war. And so local residents, Palestinian Arabs, protect his home, protect his books. So the way that there was that dialogue and stuff, there were a few, it was just a minority, I mean a pretty small minority of Palestinian Arabs that were willing to seriously discuss it. I guess the big question is, if the humanist Zionists had more political success and seemed like they could really make it happen, I think there might have been more prospects. I don't, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to give other people.
Yeah, okay. I just want to make sure you got it.
Yeah, but yeah, maybe I'll return to this later.
Yeah, thank you for your talk and your book, which I read actually, and I'm a fan of. I just wanted to say one, I think, interesting work that speaks to what Roger is asking about is Zachary Lockman's Comrades and Enemies.
Okay, yeah.
Which is precisely about the railway workers
Right.
and mandate
I remember
Palestine,
that, right, that's okay.
including all the way, Haifa plays a central role
Right.
there, and he talks about the tension in building a labor alliance
Right.
and the eventual choice that the Jewish workers make between siding with Zionism versus their class interests, and why that happened, and so on and so forth. And there he also talks about how part of the problem why there isn't a reciprocal side to this is because built into the very British mandate is the Balfour Declaration. So they don't wanna recognize the mandate at all. So they don't wanna play that game. But what I appreciated about your book is actually what you just said. Beyond the elaboration on Arendt is how you put Arendt in dialogue with Shohat and Said, which for me are the two kind of contemporary thinkers on Israel-Palestine and what binationalism and what a solution would look like. So I was wondering if you would be willing to share a little bit more about what made you go down that route, what made you think of not just stopping it at, Arendt and what she has to say, but the thinking that, as you described it here, of trying to see Shohat and Said as taking further what in very different ways. Of course, Shohat to completely breaking down the idea of the Arab Jew, so to speak, and Said the victims of Zionism.
Right, yeah. So at first this was just a very Jewish project. So it was really just looking at the Jewish dissenters, pre-1948 and then to the present. I did though, I sort of struggled, okay, well, how much do I want to get into the past? How much of an expert do I want to become? I mean, that's part of the daunting thing, is entering into that. Now, Said, I'd read a lot. And so, in general, I'm thinking of just exemplars to pick instead of a big range. Yeah. So, it did make sense. In particular, I'd read Said, and even in interviews where he does say some favorable things about Magnus and Buber and Arendt. And so, it was fairly logical for me to do Said, and I could certainly see how I could use Said to kind of correct or just modify, build more depth to how this would look in a generally symmetrical fashion. For Shohat, I had an older student, older than me, this is back, I think when I was first starting in 2016, who's actually born he's Jewish, he was born in Egypt, sort of on the right, but kind of open-minded, so I allowed him to audit my class. And at one point he just said, he was skeptical of all of this, because I was teaching a theme class, actually, I wanted to get my project going. But he said something, you're looking at all these kind of Jewish intellectuals back then, the actual Jews of the Middle East, well, they actually had to do that coexistence. So why don't you do more of that? And then, I had some familiarity with Ella Shohat, but didn't know her in depth, so then I just kind of immersed myself. I was actually trying to figure out probably was going to be Ella Shochat. I was looking at others too. But
Can you say
again,
who she is? Because I don't think a lot of us know.
so she's of Iraqi Jewish origin, starting in the 1980s. She's inspired in part by Edward Said of post-colonial studies if Edward Said was first famous for looking at Zionism from the perspective of the victims, meaning the Palestinians, Ella Shochat comes around by the late 1980s, looking at Zionism from the perspective, I guess, of its second biggest victims, the Mizrahim, or the Arab Jews. And so she's written kind of a series of things looking at how the nature of Zionism, I mean, part of it is Orientalist in terms of just looking at the Arab part of Arab Jews as inferior. But there's also just the problem that overlaps with what Arendt, I think, would agree with, at least, is that your nationalism is so simplistic that you can't even deal with a complex identity. So you can't deal. The Arab Jew is one or the other has to go. And in a way that was true also as pan-Arab, as Arab nationalism is taking off at that point. It becomes harder for the Jews like in Iraq and Egypt and so forth. So she basically uses some of Edward Said's ideas of Orientalism with this focus on the Arab Jew. And so it's very critical. In one sense, he's very critical of how Zionism simplifies and homogenizes the Jewish condition and really has no clean way to deal with these Jews not part of Europe. It's just not part of their. The big problem is their Arab identity. Is if one thing we're not supposed to be is Arab. And then the affirmative thing is this actually, we do have the potential of these more complex identities, so we can have a more complex nationalism. So I thought she also, I think, provides a very healthy, productive, in part a corrective to Arendt and the others in a way to think about identity. So I'd say in short, she's the pioneer of kind of critical Mizrahi Jewish literature.
Yeah, did you wanna?
No? Okay.
I appreciated that. Thank you so
okay,
much.
Are there any students who'd like to ask a question? I'd love to have some student questions.
I'm still formulating.
Oh, okay.
It'll be here in like 10 seconds.
Great.
You can wait. Anyone else? Oh, there's a question behind you.
Yeah, just to take it in a little bit of a different direction. I think you gave a wonderful outline of how this kind of worked, but I wonder about the engine of economic determinism resulting in what is now a truly illiberal state. So the whole settlement project really gained steam with the Israeli government abandoning its social democratic economic philosophy and subscribing to neoliberalism. So basically it kind of reminded me of how the US dealt with its flow of immigrants. You know, you're impoverished, we'll give you free land. And so as the neoliberalism impoverished Israelis, I just wonder how important that was in strengthening that kind of settler nationalist sentiment, because that was the way in which people could afford to live.
Right. It was one way that it helps improve the Mizrahi condition. So yeah, with the settlements, because a lot of them got jobs and moved up economically.
Right.
Yeah. I don't think I covered it as well as I originally wanted to do. I mean, part of the excitement, right, of the old socialist Zionism, right? A lot of people now aren't even aware that, most of the early Zionists were socialists. And some of them, particularly like there's the left socialist Zionists who are clearly anti-imperialist. And so the socialist element is very exciting. There's the contradiction from the outset with the nationalism. But the depressing thing is, on the one hand, even the socialism, and in a way Arendt's warning that all these exciting things about Zionism would start to fade, it would start to be sacrificed to the need for a strong state. And then you get this further element, by the late 70s, 80s, and so it's not just, the Likud party is a party that finally gets power in 1977, and they're the engines of the big expansion of settlements. But even, say, the formerly socialist party, the Labor Party, and people like Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, they're all in that neoliberal direction. And I hadn't kind of thought of it actually the way you said it, but it does make sense is that these two negative trends, at least for those of us looking for some kind of social justice direction, which is what the humanist Zionists were looking for, is they both feed into each other, and that is part of the problem. Now so Netanyahu is like the ultimate neoliberal capitalist, and so he's often like wined and dined at places like Harvard and stuff because of the capitalism part, not the nationalism part, and he has figured that out to the extent that while they are still getting lots of U.S. aid, as we know, military security aid, they have diversified themselves under neoliberal capitalism, and so while it still helps for them to have that U.S. aid, that dependency, this is another challenge. And Edward Said, too, he warned Palestinians, too, the PLO has become kind of corrupted by this neoliberalism. So that's another element that I didn't quite, I guess, have the bandwidth to fully work out, I confess. It was kind of there, and I was excited about the socialist element, but you're making me think that I should really try to tackle it head on. And so, maybe that's the best I can answer.
Thank you. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is kind of a long, multi-pronged question.
Multi-pronged, okay.
Take notes, yeah.
Okay.
I'm just gonna read it because otherwise I'll lose my head.
Makes
But
sense.
today we mostly have Zionist Jews and anti-Zionist Jews, albeit on a spectrum, but there's little public discourse on humanist Zionists who often get subsumed into liberal Zionism due to the conflation of Zionism with Israel rather than with the general drive for the betterment of the Jewish people. A problem here is that there are differing definitions of Zionism. Is there a space for humanist Zionism within anti-Zionist Jewish movements if humanist Zionists define Zionism as betterment of the Jewish people and anti-Zionist Jews define Zionism as belief in the legitimacy of the state of Israel as an ethno-national state? So that's part one. And then part two is, how do we reconcile Arendt's rhetoric and, if I may, blueprints for the current situation with the rhetoric of anti-Zionist Jews, which is mostly grounded in discourse of Palestinian liberation, decolonization, and land back?
All right. I'll start with the first one. It'll take me a while to get to the second one. The first one is really one big motivation for my book, is that it almost becomes used as an insult one way or another. Look, I've been part of Jewish Voice for Peace, which is kind of the premier one. But sometimes, if you say something that seems a little too soft on Israel or not discounting two-state, you're kind of called like a Zionist light or something. And so it's sometimes used too crude as an insult. Certainly other right groups in my community, anyone who's anti-Zionist is by definition anti-Semitic. There's no distinction. And so it's a problem that the terms become, I think, more or less ruined. In my final chapter, I sort of contemplate, do I still call myself a Zionist? Do I call myself a humanist Zionist? Well, I'm not going to call myself anti-Zionist, but it does have all this baggage, and it seems to be so associated now with the demand for a hegemonic Jewish nation state. So I just said, maybe binationalism is a better term, but something about Jewish self-determination is so important. My worry with a lot of anti-Zionist Jews is most want to avoid going down talking about self-determination, Jewish self-determination in that area. So I think that's a mistake, is if that's part of the deep attachment. And so ultimately I think one does need, at least an historical understanding, that Zionism had all these different parts. And if you still want to think about how Jewish self-determination can be reimagined, so it's not a zero-sum game with Palestinian nationalism, then at least you need to sort of think through. And so the dichotomy that's developed even between liberal Zionist Jews and anti-Zionist Jews needs a wider conversation. So Arendt's rhetoric with, look, Arendt is, I mean, one professor I talked to at UCSD, history professor, likes Hannah Arendt but doesn't like her stuff on Zionism that much. She said, look, she's mostly used by anti-Zionists. I mean, that's the ideas they're picking from Hannah Arendt. And I remember I brought a guest Israeli speaker a number of years ago, and he just said, yeah, Hannah Arendt's anti-Zionist. And so it's it's odd. So she is often just dismissed as anti-Zionist, but it turns out, right, that it's more complex. Look, I think if you bring Arendt in with some of these others, but also with Said, Shokhat, there's Leila Fard. I mean, there's a number of people kind of writing along this line. She's one element. It's not about liking everything. I mean, Arendt's got some racist comments she made too. So it's not like she's perfect by any means, but some of these big ideas, I think, could be used for the complexity. So I don't know, does that answer the second question?
Not really.
No? Okay. So can you get to the heart of it again?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question was, how do we reconcile it? So Arendt's rhetoric, she's a Zionist in that she supports the betterment of the Jewish people, and she's not as, because we're working with two different definitions of Zionism.
Okay.
And so we're working with a definition of Zionism as supporting the legitimacy of a Jewish nation state, and we're looking at Zionism as a belief in the betterment of the Jewish people. And Arendt, from what I understand and from what I've read of her work, lands somewhere in between, leaning more towards betterment of the Jewish people, and that she's only okay with Israel existing so long as it is not an ethnocratic or settler colonial dominating state. And so, given the current moment that we're in, where if you go to JVP's website, which is the foremost Jewish organization, and for Palestine, they talk specifically about the fight for Palestinian. Wait, let me actually quote very specifically with Palestinian freedom struggle. And so my question is there a way to? I guess it's can humanist Zionism be incorporated into anti-Zionism? Basically, I think one of the problems with anti-Zionism and anti-Zionist Jews that Arendt is really speaking to is that anti-Zionist Jews need to have something more than a shared political identity and ideology, need to have the social, need to have the spiritual. What was the phrase you used around, self-determination needs to be more than political. And so, can humanist Zionism be incorporated into anti-Zionist Judaism in order to contribute that self-determining rhetoric and praxis, or because anti-Zionist Judaism and anti-Zionism and humanist Zionism are operating under, from what I understand, unless I'm wrong, two completely different definitions.
Well, so have you read Mark Ellis or Judith Butler or?
No, I have some reading to do.
No, I'm sorry. No, I was just curious if you had, because you do seem pretty well read.
I've read Butler, but not necessarily their specific work on Zionism.
Okay, yeah, I think it's called Parting Ways. She's very influenced by Arendt. And then Mark Ellis is a Jewish theologian. He sort of sees himself as Jewish liberation theology, who's very influenced more by Buber, but also by Arendt. So they both work off ideas from Arendt and Buber. So Butler much more off Arendt. And so they're certainly using at least the critique part. So you can certainly use the biting critique of Arendt. So that's part of what perhaps anti-Zionists like a lot. Even the sense of the solidarity of the oppressed. And so like Butler has written that is one thing. I mean, if you look back at the Jewish diaspora condition, it's exile, it's being unwanted by the state. The Palestinians were the more current version of that. She does say that now it's the Palestinians are the chief interlocutors, but there are those elements. I think it's the critique and the way of thinking about how the two peoples could do this kind of after the reckoning. The reckoning first has to do with the Jewish community. It's incumbent upon them to deal with what they've done to the Palestinians. But then you do need that reconciliation. I think Buber is more useful for that than Arendt. Arendt didn't write as much about that, so she's probably better for the critique and thinking about the danger of those who are outside of the dominant nation. But look at the humanist Zionists collectively with bringing Buber in. The idea of a shared history that Edward Said really picks up on, and really Ella Shofat does too, is that understanding the collective traumas of each community and figuring out how to move forward. So not making them into just why our side has been wronged, but how our paths came together and how we can move forward. So that all comes, or at least that's all there in the humanist Zionist way of thinking, more so Buber, but it's not inconsistent with Arendt wrote. So I think there's ways, look, there is that bottom line tension between one is saying, still, we need to think something exciting and positive about that experiment. And in general, Ellis and Butler and the other Elon Pape don't want to think about, it's all too compromised by the settler colonialism. So there's going to be just irreconcilable. So maybe that's a better effort at answering your question.
I have another question. I don't want to anybody else.
I want to push your question a little bit, if that's all right with you, which is to say, in the 1960s, obviously, Arendt starts to go over to Israel to observe the Eichmann trial, and she says, that even though the Israeli state is the kind of state she didn't think Zionism should be, she supports it.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering how you deal with that, Arendt. Does that come into your book? And how does she, how do you think she navigates that, on the one hand, the Israel that's not the one she sought, but yet nevertheless she supports in some way?
Yeah, so I cover it by looking, at Eichmann in Jerusalem. The part that sticks with her is still opposing this kind of tribal nationalism, right? That has to be Israel. That does the trial and using the trial for propaganda reasons and the whole appeal to it. Yes, the Jews were the victim, but the story can't just be how the world has always hated Jews, but thinking about the conditions that led to this. And so she retains that. By this point, she's kind of made her peace, as you said, that Israel happens to exist, and it does sort of exist in representing the Jewish state. And after I mentioned this, after the 67 war, she says some things I think that can throw off people like me. I mean, she's first very excited about, so she too is caught up in that euphoria.
Absolutely.
In 73, she's helping organize rallies that aren't very sophisticated or nuanced. And so she's changed to some extent. I think part of it is it no longer became her central issue. And so she had kind of made her peace with the state of Israel. So I say she doesn't really have much. It's regrettable because she doesn't die till 1975, but she doesn't have anything interesting. At least I've never come across it. With occupation, the post-1967 thing. So it's more like we're mostly drawing from her writings in the 1940s, and then there's still some elements that are, I think, really valuable, and I commend Jerusalem, but mostly, particularly for the kind of stuff I'm doing, it's those essays in the 1940s. So, yes. Buber stayed a little more true to himself, because Buber stayed committed to these issues until his death in 1965.
We have time for one more question.
Sure.
Last one. Student?
Anyone else? I can ask.
Are you
I'm
Okay.
You don't see me, but
We're all students today.
Yes.
But students were silent. No, just to the initiative. To what extent you think Israel and Zionism could have served as an unconscious model for her other analysis, such as the United States? The own revolution is, of course, about founding a polity and being so excited about founding a new polity. And then, of course, there are problems on the way, and you forget this lost heritage, etc., which is kind of true also about Israel in her view. Maybe the founding is a great idea. And the whole thing doesn't strike me as particularly anti-imperialist. She, for example, quotes Harrington on the Commonwealth of Growth, which is, I mean, the model of imperialism of British Empire. Which she doesn't say this, but it's obvious. This is a skeptical kind of comment about generally thinking that a good, nice a political theorist is necessarily has moral views on all the questions. Maybe she's not that much against imperialism, but in her late work. And then Israel would not really. What's the problem about Israel if we are not anti-imperialist?
Interesting, right. Okay, yeah, so two things come to mind. There's one, I think there's the biography, Hannah Arendt, The Love of the World, with young girl. She argues that lots of her ideas on kind of nationalism and even like this alternative society came out of her excitement, starting in the late 30s, 40s with Zionism. And I think once she's bitterly disillusioned, she then moves fully on to these other things. Like even like the inspiration for origins of totalitarianism first starts with, obviously she's thinking about the Jewish condition. Look, I think she's at her best. Her anti-imperialist self is at her best, probably in Origins of Totalitarianism and in her biting critique of the mainstream Zionist community. It is true that later things she writes are no longer comfortably. And so I guess part of it, she wrote a lot of things. Sometimes didn't necessarily think through and sometimes overstated. And so there's elements, I don't think anyone is an uncritical believer in Arendt. So there are some things. And so some really scoff at even the idea of calling her anti-imperialist. But I think there's at least elements, and it's pretty strong, particularly in these writings in the 1940s. So that's what I focus on. So, yeah.
Can I make a recommendation?
Yeah, please.
Maybe you've
That'd be
already read
good.
it. Have you read Hagar Kotev's latest book, A Colonizing South, Home and Homelessness in Israel Palestine?
No.
I would really suggest you have a look at it. She's an Israeli political theorist who can no longer work in Israel.
Wow.
She
So what's the name of the
was
book?
Hagar Kotev, Kotef. It's an excellent book. It won a few awards and an association for political theory. She has a very different take on Arendt.
Oh, okay.
And it makes quite provocative arguments in terms of all the problems that exist and historically existed in terms of any kind of binational or an anti-imperialist project that you can actually trace back to Zionism. I think some chapters that might be quite really helpful if you want to continue with the idea of, going back to Arendt. But again, I look forward to reading through.
That would be great. Yeah, I'll definitely read that. Yeah. Yeah, I have a chapter in mind for an edited volume on Hannah Arendt, so I need to kind of go back to reading Arendt. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, gentlemen.
Great focus.